Right now, as you read this, a small cluster of neurons somewhere in your brain may be receiving less blood than they need. Not dramatically less. Not enough to drop you to the floor or steal the words from your mouth. Just less. A microclot drifting through a vessel so narrow it barely registers on any scan you've had. And within the next few hours, those cells may die quietly, without announcement, without pain, without a single sign you'd ever think to report to a doctor. Your brain will compensate. It always does. It will reroute, rewire, absorb the damage like a building quietly shifting its load-bearing walls inward. And you will go about your day completely unaware that anything happened at all. That is what a silent stroke is. Not a dramatic event, a disappearance. The term itself is almost a contradiction. We think of strokes as alarms, as crises, as the moment everything stops. And some are. But a significant portion of strokes, some researchers estimate up to a quarter of all ischemic events, produce no recognizable symptoms whatsoever. No facial drooping, no slurred speech, no sudden, terrifying inability to raise one arm. Just a small region of tissue, no longer receiving oxygen, quietly folding inward. Gone. And here's the thing. The absence of symptoms doesn't mean the absence of consequence. It means the consequence is slower, harder to trace, more insidious than the kind that lands you in an emergency room, because at least that one announces itself. What would you do if you'd already had one and never knew? To understand what happens in those silent hours, you have to go inside the event itself. A blood vessel narrows, maybe from years of elevated pressure, maybe from a clot that formed in a heart beating irregularly. And a small region of brain tissue loses its supply. The neurons there need oxygen every second. They begin to fail within minutes. The surrounding tissue, the penumbra in clinical terms, survives, but it is stressed, electrically disrupted, chemically altered. The brain starts compensating almost immediately. Other pathways activate. Adjacent regions absorb some of the lost function. And because the damaged area is small, because it may be in a region not associated with speech or movement or any function you consciously test every day, the whole event resolves without a single felt symptom. The body buries its own emergency. This is both remarkable and deeply dangerous, because the compensation works. Until it doesn't. Until the damage accumulates. And this is where the risk architecture comes in. Silent strokes do not happen randomly. They happen in bodies that have been quietly preparing the conditions for years. Chronic high blood pressure is the most common predisposing factor, and it is worth sitting with what that actually means. Not a number on a screen. Years. Years of your arterial walls under slightly more force than they were built for, stiffening, thickening, losing elasticity, narrowing the interior diameter of vessels the brain depends on absolutely. The body adapts, masks the pressure, never sends a distress signal strong enough to feel. You feel fine. The pressure keeps building. And somewhere in the vast, intricate network of vessels supplying your brain, the conditions for an event are being assembled, 1 millimeter of arterial change at a time. Atrial fibrillation is the other major hidden driver, and its stealth is extraordinary. In AF, the upper chambers of the heart quiver rather than contract cleanly, and blood can pool and clot in a small pouch called the left atrial appendage. Those clots can break free. They travel. They find the brain. And they create exactly the kind of silent small vessel occlusion that produces no symptom, no alarm, no record. Unless you were already wearing a cardiac monitor when it happened. Many people with AF don't know they have it until a stroke, silent or otherwise, reveals it indirectly. That's the particular cruelty of this system. The risk factor hides inside the event it caused. Sleep apnea belongs in this conversation and almost never gets there. Hours of nightly oxygen deprivation, repeated cycles of the airway collapsing, blood oxygen dropping, the body jolting itself awake to breathe, create a chronic inflammatory state in the vasculature. They drive blood pressure up, They stress the arterial walls. They increase clotting tendency. And they do it every night, invisibly, while the person experiencing it believes they are simply sleeping. Loud. Badly. Without understanding that the cardiovascular cost of untreated sleep apnea can accumulate toward exactly the kind of cerebrovascular damage that shows up years later as unexplained cognitive drift. If you find yourself consistently there, subscribe. Because what we're about to get into, the window, the compounding damage, what detection actually looks like, is where this gets personal in a way that changes how you understand your own risk. After a silent stroke, the brain enters a period of heightened vulnerability. The damaged tissue has disrupted the local blood-brain barrier. Inflammatory signals are elevated. The vasculature in the surrounding region is physiologically altered. Studies consistently show that the risk of a subsequent event, including a symptomatic major stroke, is significantly elevated in the days and weeks following a silent stroke. This is the window nobody sees because nobody knew to open it. The event was silent. No one responded. No one adjusted medications, monitored blood pressure, or initiated anticoagulation. The brain sustained its first hit, and the conditions that caused it remained fully intact. And this brings us to the compounding problem. A single silent stroke is not the same as accumulated silent strokes. The brain compensates beautifully for small losses, until the losses aggregate past the threshold of compensation. This is what researchers now call silent cerebrovascular burden, a pattern visible on MRI as white matter hyperintensities, small vessel changes, quiet scars from events that never announce themselves, the cognitive drift that eventually becomes undeniable, the word retrieval that takes a beat too long, the processing speed that is quietly downshifted, the executive function that isn't quite what it used to be, often traces back to this accumulated, invisible history. The wild part is that by the time any of it is measurable on a neuropsychological test, the underlying damage has been building for years, sometimes decades. Standard checkups miss this. A routine physical does not include brain imaging. A blood pressure reading in a clinical setting can be misleadingly normal even in someone with significant hypertension at home. An irregular heartbeat missed in a 12-second ECG window goes undetected. This is not a failure of medicine. It is a structural mismatch between the speed of silent damage and the frequency of standard screening. What does catch it, when caught, is MRI with flare sequences, a type of imaging that makes white matter lesions visible, that shows the small vessel disease that predicts future risk. If you have known risk factors, hypertension, atrial fibrillation, diabetes, sleep apnea, a family history of stroke, you can ask about brain MRI as part of a neurological or preventive cardiology evaluation. You can ask about ambulatory cardiac monitoring if you suspect intermittent arrhythmia. You can request 24-hour blood pressure monitoring if your clinical readings seem inconsistent with how you actually feel. Before the final piece, drop a comment and tell me, did you know silent strokes were this common? Had you ever considered your own risk before today? Here is where the writing needs to change register, because the research on intervention and recovery is genuinely, unexpectedly hopeful. And that hope deserves a different kind of attention. Blood pressure control, sustained and consistent, reduces cerebrovascular event risk dramatically. Not marginally, dramatically. Anticoagulation in atrial fibrillation reduces cardioembolic stroke risk by more than half. Treatment of obstructive sleep apnea reduces inflammatory markers, blood pressure, and clotting tendency, and improves brain oxygenation on a nightly basis. Moderate aerobic exercise increases cerebral blood flow, stimulates neuroplasticity, and has been associated with reduced white matter progression in high-risk individuals. These are not soft lifestyle suggestions. They are interventions with real, documented neurological effects. And the brain, this is the part that matters. The brain is not static. Even in adulthood, even in later life, it retains the capacity for neuroplastic adaptation. Damaged regions do not simply vanish. Surrounding tissue reorganizes. New pathways form. The brain does what it has always done in the face of loss. It reaches for another route. The first actionable step, knowing your blood pressure, knowing your rhythm, knowing whether your sleep is actually restorative, carries the full weight of every silent event that happened without being caught, every risk factor that built unchecked for years. It is not a small thing. You started this knowing almost nothing about what your brain might be quietly managing right now. That is already different. Awareness is not reassurance. It is not meant to be, but it is the first condition of action. The brain that has been silently compensating for damage it never told you about is the same brain that, if given the right conditions, is still, against what you might expect, against what the silence implied, capable of repair. The damage was invisible. The knowledge doesn't have to be.